China's tariffs on the US have come into effect today, adding a levy on many US farm products. The tariffs of 10 to 15% will affect items such as beef, poultry and grains. China is also halting soybean imports from 3 US companies and stopping purchases of US wood. Beijing's measures come after US President Donald Trump doubled the universal tariff on Chinese goods from 10 to 20% last week. Those are expected to affect $300 billion worth of goods and could cost US consumers up to $25 billion. And for more on this, we have DW business reporter Kassandra Sundt in the studio now. Kassandra, the retaliatory tariffs that China now put on certain US products are not as high, suspiciously, as the ones imposed by US on Chinese products. Why is that?
That's right, yeah. What jumped out to me is how specific these tariffs are, as opposed to the kind of broad sweeping tariffs we've seen from the US side. So let's zoom in for a moment on soybeans. There's a stopping of imports from 3 US companies, and then this 10% duty on the remaining American soybeans coming into China. Soybeans were one of the US's top exports into China, and China consumes a lot of soybeans. They were in fact worth $12 billion last year alone. And the US is one of the top producers of soybeans in the world, and it's almost planting season in those regions of the United States where soybeans are grown. So in total, when we zoom out, there's just $22 billion that are covered by these tariffs right now. But right now, between 10 and 15%, there is room to kind of step them up. We saw that already on the American side when 10% tariffs last month became 20% this month. So there is still room for China to take further action.
How risky are these tariffs in this trade war?
There is risk on both sides, to be frank. So on the Chinese side, the bright spot in the Chinese economy is exports. They're really relying on it to prop up most of their economy. Right now in China, they're worried about things like deflation, and there's just frankly not enough domestic demand to make up any kind of lost destinations, so to speak. On the U.S. side, it's a bit more complicated because there's been so many actions from the U.S. government recently that will have an effect on the economy, but the signals have been maybe starting to go from green to yellow on the U.S. economy side. For example, employment's been stubborn, hovering around 4% there. Inflation has been creeping up month after month. And on Wall Street, we've actually seen 3 consecutive weeks of declines across all major indices. So while exports in a typical year for the U.S. economy are only around 10%, 10 to 12%, there's just not a lot of headroom in the economy right now to absorb too many big hits. And Trump, in his kind of Trumpian way, did acknowledge this. He refused to rule out that a recession could happen as a result of his policies. And the last time that Trump and China got into a tariff war in 2018, agricultural products were hit quite hard. They, in fact, saw $27 billion in losses, which then required $23 billion in compensation from the federal government towards those farms.
Now, that's clearly not a pleasant outlook for the U.S. economy. If this trade war, I don't know, deteriorates, accelerates, what then? What's next?
We're not really seeing any conciliatory behavior on either side. Both camps are kind of posturing in their positions. Some of the language we've seen from China, for example, from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, saying China will fight till the end, that if the U.S. insists on waging a tariff war, trade war, or any other kind of war, they're gonna keep with it. So Chinese leaders do want to make it clear they've learned a lot from the last time Mr. Trump was in office and a trade war was on the horizon, and they want to be seen as conducting this on equal footing. And when we see how Mr. Trump speaks to other strong men in the world and views them and speaks about them, this could possibly be a way to find a negotiating point moving forward.
DW business reporter Kassandra Sundt. Thank you very much, Kassandra.
Well, joining us now from Hong Kong is Alicia García-Herrero. She's chief economist for Asia Pacific at the French investment bank Natixis. Thanks for being with us. Tell us, how are Asian markets responding to these tariffs?
Asian markets are confused because the only tariffs that are still in place are basically those on China. We have seen tariffs lifted for Canada, Mexico. We still aren't sure whether Japan will be hit by steel and aluminum tariffs. So, it's kind of confusing. China seems to be on, but at the same time, and this is good news is China's biggest, most important economic gathering of the year, the so-called two sessions, actually showed China's conviction that they can still grow 5% no matter these tariffs. So, the market is like, okay, can China really make it? Are these tariffs really relevant for China? Is China really ready for this? And maybe China has been preparing so much that it won't hit the economy as much as expected. So this is why the markets are very confused at the moment.
So the markets are currently confused, but these tariffs don't come fully unanticipated. What impact are analysts expecting this trade war to have on China's economy?
Yes. So we have our estimates. Just to give you a sense of dimension, China, so Trump 1.0 tariffs on China, which we thought were 35%, but because they were not across the board, they ended up being around 19.5. So we are now seeing a doubling, basically, of tariffs. Maybe there will be some exemptions and it will be a little bit less. At that time, what China really did was to diversify away from the U.S., which is now only 13% of Chinese exports, into Vietnam, largest re-exporter towards the U.S., and to a lesser extent, Mexico, Thailand, Malaysia. So the impact wasn't as large. Now, can China do this again? Our impression is that as long as the U.S. does not impose tariffs on, say, Vietnam or Mexico, or stops Mexico from importing from China, the impact can be rather limited. What is worse of all for China, and this is very important because it's starting to happen, is a slowdown of the U.S. economy. It's more about growth from the U.S. going everywhere for imports than the tariffs themselves.
So there's a strategy of circumventing these tariffs to some degree. But how well are banks and companies in the region overall positioned to deal with this highly volatile trading environment that we're seeing now with the new Trump administration?
Yeah. So, of course, everyone's trying to figure whether tariffs will be imposed beyond China because, as I said, it might not be so relevant for China, but it could be extremely relevant for others. Think about tariffs on semiconductors, for example, for Taiwan. That would be massive. So we need to figure that one out. But there's other things happening, yeah? Geopolitical risk. What does Ukraine mean for Asia? Taiwan, the South China Sea. So these are big question marks for Asian markets. I would say much bigger than tariffs.
Okay, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. That was Alicia García-Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at French investment bank Natixis in Hong Kong. Let's cross over to DW correspondent James Chater. He joins us from Taipei. James, tell us more about the signal China wants to send with its tariffs on U.S. agricultural products.
Well, Terry, right from the beginning of this latest round of measures that we've seen between the US and China, the general consensus has been that China has tried to take a more targeted approach compared to the more sweeping measures that the US has imposed on China. That's, of course, broadly focused on agricultural products. That being said, this will target some $21 billion of US agricultural products going into to China. And so there will be concern, of course, that this is going to contribute to inflation, something which, of course, in his State of the Union address last week, Trump conceded might be a problem for US manufacturers, for US businesses, as a result of these more combative trade policies that he's undertaking.
What impact, James, could this trade war have on China's economy and, in turn, on the U.S. economy?
Well, one of the really key things we're going to be looking at as it relates to China is deflation. We had new data out just today which showed that inflation had fallen at its fastest rate in China in some 13 months. Actually, prices in February were lower compared to the same period last year. Now, just to explain why this is such a big problem for the Chinese economy and Chinese policymakers specifically, is that deflation, the kind of broad logic of deflation is that it dents consumer sentiment. It will dampen consumption because the idea is that if you simply wait a few weeks or months, the same product is likely to be a little bit cheaper. The reason on a more broader level why that is such a massive problem for China is that boosting consumption, boosting what has historically been very weak consumption, is the central economic goal of the Chinese government and Chinese economic policymakers, transitioning the country away from what was historically an investment and export-led growth model to one that is really driven by consumption. That we're seeing this really unpredictable international environment with more tariffs, disruptions to supply chains, and a general lack of confidence in trade between these two countries in the context of kind of very persistent deflation is really not conducive to those central goals that China is trying to mitigate against and which was really at the forefront of discussions at the National People's Congress.
Now, U.S. President Donald Trump keeps insisting that his relationship with China's President Xi is very good. Does Beijing see it that way, James?
Well, of course, Trump has frequently offered quite complimentary remarks about Xi Jinping. At the same time, though, this is, of course, Trump that we're dealing with. In a few weeks or months, even in a few days, we could be looking at a very different picture when it comes to sentiment from Trump towards the Chinese leader. But some interesting comments that we saw in that briefing by Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, in the course of the National People's Congress last week, in which he took a very combative approach to the U.S. administration, saying that Trump was two-faced, at the same time trying to court Chinese officials while imposing more tariffs because of the belief that Beijing wasn't doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States. He also said, quote, that decoupling and severed links will only isolate those who impose them. So from senior members within the Chinese leadership, a very combative approach to the US administration. But an important point also to remember in the course of these trade tensions is that China has taken, broadly speaking, a slightly different response to Canada and Mexico, for example, to other countries which have been a target of these measures by Trump. Whilst those two countries have been trying to take calls with the US administration, really trying to negotiate out in some cases of these trade measures, China has been much more cold in its approach, it's fair to say. And what they're really trying to get across here is that Beijing will not be a supplicant to the US in the context of any negotiations to end these escalatory trade tensions. They will not want to concede on their own interests simply to appease Trump. And that's really the dynamic we're going to be looking at over the next weeks and months as these trade tensions potentially escalate, but as the leaders try and walk back from some of the more drastic measures too.
James, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, James Chater, in Taipei.